Well, Troy, thanks so much for joining us for the Security Summit today.
Yeah, thanks, Ari. It's been a good day.
Yeah, so we covered a lot of ground. We talked about apps and APIs. We talked about the move to zero trust, but I think everybody got super excited hearing your perspective on the growing challenge from credential abuse.
Yeah, excited, scared, one or the other. The credential abuse is really interesting because we're just seeing, not just so many data breaches, but so many occurrences of things like credential stuffing lists, where people are just taking all of these different data breaches, which are bad enough on their own, and then they're going, we'll just take all the passwords out of that one, and that one, we'll combine them all up, and then suddenly you've got like these lists of sometimes billions of email address password pairs, and due to the prevalence of password reuse, they work in all these different places.
Absolutely. Well, and I think people knew about your site, the destination that you've created with Have I Been Pwned, but I think they were surprised at how much information was just generally available on social media and the internet at large.
Yeah, so I was talking a bit about the dark web, and there's always this perception that the bad stuff is always on the dark web, and I think people think that the dark web is somewhere scary and it's like hard to get to. I always imagine they've got like this in real life equivalent view of like, you go down to the docks and it's dark and there might be bad guys and stuff. But it's like, no, it's a Tor browser, and then you're on the dark web, and there's stuff there. But the point I was trying to make in the talk is that, yeah, it's there, but also it's like all over the clear web, and it's all over Twitter, and here's a tweet with 5 links in it, and there's literally like a terabyte worth of email address password pairs just from the tweet. So it's just socialized really extensively.
Well, and it's not necessarily socialized by the scary boogeymen that people think are, orchestrating all of these attacks. I mean, you gave some examples where it's basically people who don't actually realize the scale or the gravity of what they're doing.
I don't think they do, and I wonder if it's partly this, on the internet you've got some degree of anonymity, and it's people sort of sitting there going, let's say it's the Ashley Madison data breach. It's just data, I'll just share this around without sort of being conscious of the consequences. And I made the point in the talk today, like this is an incident where people died as a result. There were multiple suicides.
Incredible.
And you can go to a clear web website and click the button, there's all the data.
Well, and from a business perspective, if somebody who's in charge of information security or data security for a company hears a talk like yours, it can sometimes seem like, where do I begin? I mean, there's so many challenges, there's so many ways that my data can be compromised and then that data can be proliferated. If you were to give people any advice about how they should think about getting started by protecting against a breach like this?
I think the first thing is that I really want people to recognize that this is a massive problem. I find that there tends to be a degree of nonchalance. And I always lament, like I'll see a big data breach and you'll see this happen and people go, this will be the watershed moment. People will start taking it seriously now. Ashley Madison was a good example of that. That was a really, really impactful incident. And then it's like, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months down the line, you're seeing exactly the same stuff over and over again. And you're sort of looking at it going, didn't you see the thing that happened like just a few months ago? Like, why did you guys not really start to take this more seriously there? So unfortunately, data breaches seem to be one of these things where there's a degree of nonchalance about it until it actually happens. And then once it happens, like organisations will do anything in the world to overcome it. And of course, it's too late by then. But it just seems to sort of take a serious incident before it's taken seriously a lot of the time.
And I think one thing that was particularly eye-opening was when you covered how certain companies have actually owned up to the fact that they've been breached or not. And we talked a little bit about, and I think the crowd was really interested in, the right way that you can sort of own up to something like this when it occurs.
So I made the point that I think we're sort of going through a maturity process with dealing with data breaches. And you go back a few years and there was a lot of judgment just by virtue of having had a data breach. So, no, they've had a data breach, that's terrible. And it is terrible, but where I think the sentiment has moved a little bit now is it's less about judging an organisation harshly for having the breach and more about their handling of the breach. And we're seeing incidents like the Red Cross Blood Service in Australia where yes, they had a data breach, that they actually had a partner of theirs put production data in a test environment backed up to a publicly facing web service. Like a little bad mistake to make. But the Red Cross dealt with it so professionally and in such a profoundly responsible way. Everything from the CEO doing a press conference within 72 hours of me reporting the incident and saying, look, we're really sorry about this. We take responsibility. We're not just going, bad security, threat actor, et cetera, et cetera. Like, this is our responsibility. We're going to take care of it. We're going to do the right thing. And we are seeing multiple cases of organisations preparing better for breaches and fortunately handling them better when they happen.
So it's an interesting point. When you're preparing for, let's not call it an eventuality, but the possibility that a breach could occur, some people have approached us as a vendor of security solutions saying, I'd like to buy a solution to the problem. And we tend to approach it more as we want to partner with you to help to resolve some of the issues that may lead to the problem, to provide you with ways that you can be more resilient from attacks. But what is your perception of the way that most companies approach trying to deal with the issue itself?
I think a lot of companies, as we were sort of touching on, tend to be very retrospective. So the incident happens, okay, now this is something that we need to take seriously. Well, one of the topics that came up today is the value of security very early on in the life cycle. And to put it in context, we know within software development that the cost of defects grows exponentially over time. So, if you have a defect at the design phase, let's say you've chosen the wrong mechanism of password storage, and this mechanism is wrong, and in design you just go, okay, that was wrong, we're going to do it differently. All right, you change your design documents. If it's in development and it's the early stages, all right, well, not too bad, we've got to rewrite some code. But if it gets into tests or into production or into data breach land, your costs just massively go up. So what I'm really trying to do, what a lot of us in the industry are trying to do, is say, look, let's shift security left in the development lifecycle. Let's try and get security embedded right from the point where we're designing, instead of just trying to tack it on at the end.
I think that makes a ton of sense. And it's this notion of secure development or secure DevOps. Some people will call it DevSecOps, and others will argue that there's no point in giving it a name. It just is something that you should build.
It's just software development.
Absolutely. So, interestingly, your solution, your platform has been built into several vendors' platforms for how they can try to do a better job of providing insight into identity and whether or not it's been compromised. Can you talk a little bit about how that came about?
Yeah, look, it's actually in a bunch of different places now. So Have I Been Pwned's got a few APIs. There's an API to see if an email address has been exposed in a breach somewhere. There's an API to see if a password's been exposed in a breach somewhere. And the password one's kind of neat. There's a whole anonymity model so that you never have to actually disclose it to Have I Been Pwned. So we're seeing things like Mozilla, for example, has built it into a service called Firefox Monitor. Mm-hmm. So Firefox Monitor is effectively a front for Have I Been Pwned, except rather than it just being me running the service, it's like all Firefox users get access to this, so that there's just massive exposure. We're seeing other organisations build in things like password checks on registration to go, look, when someone comes and registers for this website, maybe they shouldn't use a password that's been seen in 20,000 different incidents and data breaches. That's regardless of how many letters and numbers and things, probably not a good password. So there's little things like that you can do to kind of start tipping the needle in the right direction.
So I think that's interesting. When we talked a little bit about the difference between the threat of bots or automated attacks where compromised credentials will be taken and then brute force applied to websites to try to compromise whatever security protocols are in place versus the human element of human-based fraud. What's your perspective on the ways that businesses can look at those two phenomena differently?
It's a tricky thing because particularly the bot thing, bots are getting so good at emulating humans. And they need to get better at emulating humans because the defenses that we're putting in place are expecting more human-like behavior. Little simple things like the bots aren't necessarily going to use a user agent string which says, hey, I'm a nasty bot. They're going to use legitimate user agent strings from browsers. It's not always going to be the same one. That's going to change, so there's not a pattern we can match there. They're not always going to come from the same IP address. They're not going to necessarily hit at the same rate. They're going to adapt and become more and more human-like. And then particularly as we sort of get into this era of AI and all the rest of it, we use that for good in software development, but of course the bots use that for bad as well. And that's becoming a more effective way of them figuring out how to circumvent our defenses. So it's always been this way, right? Like it's always been the one-upmanship of security, but this is the challenge we're having with credential stuffing as well.
It makes a ton of sense. It's almost like an arms race. And if you think about the motivations for the people who are actually perpetrating these sorts of attacks, you talked a little bit about the whole idea of the criminal ecosystem behind credential abuse and credential compromise. But can you maybe cover a little bit about your thoughts there? What is motivating some of these attackers to continue trying to one-up each other?
There's lots of different motivations. The traditional one is financial, right? It's like, look, there's a financial motivation that could take a couple of different forms. So maybe it's that, that they want to get into some loyalty program because you have money in there, or you have something which can be converted into cash some way. You can redeem a product and the product can then be converted to cash. There's the simple selling of credentials. Threat actors want to go and take a large list of usernames and passwords, see which ones work on a service, and then be able to sell that working list for some amount of money. There's also, like in a way, I can kind of get those two things because there's an ROI on behalf of attackers and their interest is financial. There's also this other aspect which in some ways is even harder, which is that there is just a bunch of people out there that are children, hacktivists, other categories where it is a curiosity or it is something that they just want to do as an exercise. And that's hard because they no longer have the same sort of sense of ROI. So,
Right.
you might increase the effort for them, but, look, I mean, that they don't have jobs. They've got to go to school or something like that, but they've got time on their hands to be able to play with this stuff. And that actually worries me a lot because they can get enormously creative. And we definitely see a lot of that in this sort of credential stuffing realm as well.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, the idea that tenacity is almost like a badge of honor for certain types of attackers as opposed to a financial motivation really makes it challenging to make it expensive for somebody to try to compromise defenses because at the end of the day, it isn't financially motivated, as you said.
And I get it insofar as we've all sort of had, as technology people, like we've had technology challenges and you just get that bee in your bonnet and you're like, I want to solve this, I want to figure out how to do it. And there's a bunch of people out there for which things like defenses against credential stuffing poses a challenge. I mean, this is a puzzle. I mean, forget the money for a moment, this is just good fun stuff. and they want to try and get through it.
Yeah, that's wild. And it's, in many ways, the visibility and the understanding of it is probably the best defense against the ongoing and growing threat. You were recently asked to actually testify in the US about the threat of this. Can you go into a little bit about how that came about?
So I testified in Congress in late 2017, which was a really, really interesting experience. And the context of this was effectively how good can we do knowledge-based authentication in an era of data breaches? So the classic example here, in fact, I gave this example in Congress. I said, look, just before I came over, my father was trying to connect to a new ISP. And the ISP said, look, we've just got to sort of verify you are who you say you are. You say you're Steve Hunt. What's your birth date? Because if you tell us your birth date, we will know that you really are this person. And I'm just going, oh, come on. Like, it's the thing that's in all the data breaches, So the context with Congress was in this sort of traditional knowledge-based authentication model, and to be clear, this is like static knowledge-based authentication as well. You don't get to change your birth date. You don't get to change the first car you had. It's not like knowledge-based authentication such as a password where it's like it's dynamic, we can change it. So in this era where so much static KBA has been leaked all over the place, how do we do identity verification? And that's just a very new, interesting challenge that's really changed a lot in recent years.
Well, and one of the interesting things that we covered as well was this notion of friction and how much friction is actually acceptable for the use case that is relevant in whatever case it may be. So in the case of Netflix, for example, we talked about one level of password authentication that they maintain because people are using remotes to enter a password versus what you might see on a financial services website. But how do you think businesses can start to think about the risk profile for them relative to maybe the incentive for their customers to try to maintain strong password security, maybe deal with multi-factor authentication versus the potential reward that they're looking to for customer acquisition, customer retention, customer satisfaction?
So the friction situation is a perfect example of why we still have static KBA. When my father was talking to the ISP, it's like, yes, I know this is a weak security mechanism, but everyone knows their birth date. Like, everyone knows how to do it. It's the same reason we still have passwords when there are so many technically better methods. It's like everyone knows how to create a password. Sure. So that the usability is actually, in many cases, trumping the security posture or the security weakness of that mechanism. So for businesses, they've got to kind of weigh these two things up. And I, by no means, want to say that we should always just focus on security. I mean, what if we just went and said, okay, every password must be like at least 20 characters long and you must have two-factor on it. Do you actually want customers? Because that's going to be hard to have customers if you set the bar there. So the challenge is going to be for organizations, like, where do we find that sweet spot? Because there are a lot of decisions to be made where security is sort of counterintuitive to usability. Now, that said, there are some nice exceptions as well. I mean, there's a lot more intelligence in security services today that aren't immediately visible to the customer as well. And, you certainly spoke about that a lot today too. So how do we make security a more sort of natural ingrained part of the process without it impeding the ability to use the service? Because let's not forget, like the whole reason the service is here in the first place is to get customers to sign up so that we can sell the product, we can actually make money to pay the security people wanting to put all the controls in place.
Of course. Well, I mean, and I know everybody loves to pick the squares that have a picture of a car in them when the capture is presented for challenges.
That's painful.
But what do you think about, for example, moving in the direction of biometrics? Do you see that really catching on and becoming pervasive, or is it just another step towards better security in general?
I love the idea of biometrics, and I think we can probably caveat this in a few ways. So yeah, I have biometrics on all my laptops. I've got thumbprint readers. I use Windows Hello on my PC. I've got the IR camera. I've got an iPhone, so I've got Face ID. Yeah, everything that I log onto on a regular basis in terms of devices, biometrics. I still have passwords on every single one of those. In fact, people often say, they go, oh, well, biometrics kill passwords. I go, well, think about this, right? Like you get a new iPhone. You take the iPhone out of the box, and let's say it's an iPhone 10 and it's got the biometrics. Now, you've got to get on the Wi-Fi network to begin with. So, okay, there's your first password, you need that. And then you start setting it up and it says, oh, you've got to have a PIN, even if you use Face ID, because you've got to have a fallback, there's your second password. And then you go, oh, I'd really like to restore all my data from iCloud. So there's your third password. So we're like 3 passwords in, I haven't even used the phone yet. Right. But what biometrics are doing is they're changing the prevalence with which we need to enter what is ultimately an observable secret into the device. So you can get onto the train and unlock your iPhone and no one sees the PIN. And let's be fair, we have all watched people enter PINs because we're curious.
Of course.
You see this happen in public. I love that I could pull my phone out now and show you something without having to do that awkward thing of I don't really want Ari. I know he's not a bad guy, but I don't really. Yeah. This is a great mechanism. So I think the more we start to use biometrics in that fashion, the better. And then, of course, we've just got to deal with the challenges of what happens if we leak biometric data, what's the resilience of the physical hardware in these devices to things like fraudulent faces or fingerprints or things like that.
Absolutely. I mean, we talked a little bit about, for example, Apple Pay or some of these other new payment mechanisms that don't require you to do the trite sort of false sense of security of signing your name to a piece of paper.
Physically signing it.
Yeah, sure, exactly. But then you think about some of the challenges that people have highlighted where, for example, I might go to a gas station and there's credit card skimmers right there. I can't see it. I'm not an expert in what the hardware should look like. Do I end up maybe with a false sense of security around some of these protocols that people are putting in place? Or is it just a compounded or a layering of different security capabilities that at the end of the day are the best we can do?
I think it's a bit of an evolving landscape, isn't it? I mean, we're so worried about credit card skimmers in days gone by because we had mag stripes and the mag stripes would skim those.
By the way, in the States, we use those every day.
I was trying to avoid pointing that out, but yeah, so there's that. But of course, we're moving towards the likes of chip and pin, and we're moving towards NFC and other technologies that are harder to spoof in that way or to capture card data. Of course, it still happens.
Sure.
But then, it's almost like, well, the next frontier is now we're getting towards things like Apple Pay, et cetera, which are even harder to skim. So maybe this is just another reflection of the one-upmanship that you mentioned earlier on. Like this is just whatever aspect of InfoSec it is you look at, there's always this process of the security controls get better and then someone gets very, very smart at breaking it and then they get better again. That does kind of keep it interesting, though. I'll give it that much.
It definitely is. And I think, when we looked at the crowds today, people were certainly in rapt attention at your talk, and I think they took a lot away from just understanding all of the complexity that goes into maintaining adequate, let's say, security, if not robust security, in some of the areas where maybe they want to make some more investment. So I guess the last question that I'd have for you is, with security becoming a board-level mandate, or having become a board-level mandate already, and the need to explain very complex ideas to business people and lay people, including consumers, is there any advice that you'd give security practitioners out there to go about the process more effectively?
I think the best thing for security folks trying to convince, let's say executives, board level members, et cetera, of the importance of it, is demonstration. So practical things they can show people to give them those light bulb moments. I hear all the time people use have I been pwned in training contexts so that other people can see, oh wow, like my data actually has been spread around the internet. That's an example. I've used devices such as Wi-Fi pineapples before. Wi-Fi pineapple is a great device for looking at Wi-Fi networks that other phones are looking for, emulating them, and then they hop on there. And when you do this, when I do this in demos, and it's like, here's all the networks your devices are looking for. Yeah, by the way, Ari's phone has just connected to my pineapple. And then people are, oh yeah, that's actually pretty serious. Like I should pay attention to that. So those demos that have an impact on people, to my mind, are a million times more powerful than just putting up the spreadsheet of like how many people have been breached in the last year or something like that. Do something that has an impact.
I think that makes sense. Yeah, demonstration, storytelling, something to make it a little bit more tangible and real for people.
Yeah,
In a context they understand.
Put it in a context they understand, because otherwise it's just another news headline hypothetical.
Makes total sense. Well, Troy, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for joining our Security Summit today.
Awesome. Thanks, Ari. Appreciate it.
Cheers.